you've got to lead your own life and make it a reasonable life while you try and solve these problems. If you take it all as serious as it really is, then you're going to have a miserable life.
Nature Solutionaries is a podcast about conservationists who do amazing things for nature and bring inspiration into our lives. Paul Ralph Ehrlich is an American biologist best known for his warnings that population growth presents an extremely serious threat to the future of human civilization. The Population Bomb, a book that he co-authored with his wife Anne, helped start a worldwide debate on the impact of rising population that continues today. Author of 50 books and thousands of articles, Paul is the Bing Professor Emeritus of Population Studies at Stanford University, President of Stanford's Center for Conservation Biology, and also President of the Millennium Alliance for Humanity and the Biosphere. At the age of 89, he continues to work and lecture. Paul, it's a great honor to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time.
That's fine. Thank you. Thank you for the exposure. After all, I am a propagandist.
And I'm an activist, so that's good. A good combination. So I'd like to start with this question. Over the course of your life, the global population quadrupled from 2 billion in 1932 to almost 8 billion in 2021. And the United Nations estimate that in 2100 there will be somewhere between 9.4 and 12.7 billion people. How does this make you feel?
It makes me feel very depressed, and I think the United Nations is dead wrong, unfortunately. In other words, what the United Nations never considers is the possibilities for increasing the death rate. And right now, of course, with climate disruption, toxification of the entire planet, collapse of the soils in many areas, the loss of groundwater, the extinction of the biodiversity that we depend on in many ways. I'd like to think that sometime there will be 8 billion people alive and well-fed and well-cared for, because today about 2 billion aren't. And I would be much more optimistic at shooting for trying to give decent lives to 8 billion while we reduce the size of our population humanely to somewhere in the vicinity of 1 to 3 billion. The best economist in the world just came up with the estimate that in the long term, we might have a sustainable population at a Mexican standard of living, roughly, of about 3 billion people. So that might be a target to work towards because, of course, today's population isn't remotely sustainable.
And who was that economist?
That's Partha Dasgupta at Cambridge. He just finished a huge study for the British government on the economics of biodiversity.
Regarding the optimum population size, most ecologists who have thought deeply about a sustainable human population size gravitate towards the number 2 billion or less, including you. Can you briefly explain to the listeners how you came to that number?
The way that I came to that number with Anne and Gretchen Daly, two of my colleagues, was simple. We asked the question, looking primarily at energy use, what number of people could you have that would provide an optimum number of choices? That is, you have enough people so you could have big, interesting cities where you could go to the opera, go to museums, live a life of going to restaurants and so on and so forth, and also have few enough people so there would be large areas of wilderness which people could explore if they wanted to or enjoy in other ways and would support them. And it turns out that the number we came up with was between 1 and 2 billion. 2 billion probably would be good, but 1 billion would be better because it would, if you made a mistake and you really couldn't support 2 billion, you'd have some flexibility. And those are the numbers that existed at the beginning of the last century, at the beginning of the 1900s. Partha has done a much more thorough study based on similar things. The point is, everybody who looks at it understands we're way beyond the total number that we can support sustainably with a happy life. And so it really doesn't matter much. The basic conclusion we should draw is that we've got to start humanely shrinking the size of the human population and the size of the human enterprise. That includes the consumption and so on. And as we do it, science can be improved, and we can ask more questions about where to stop. But the point is, we got to start going down first. And so there's no point in just waiting until we know exactly whether the sustainable population is going to be 2.5 billion or 3 billion or 1 billion when we're already at 8 billion.
But one thing I don't understand is how can you do that humanely when we are almost 8 billion people?
Humanely, in my view, is you start treating women right immediately. You get every government in the world to put a portion of their income, and rich countries helping poor countries, to make sure that every woman has access to modern contraception and backup abortion. And you start doing whatever you can in various places to change the value of children to something expensive, so that, for example, any woman who has a choice in, say, whether she wants to have a fifth child or a motorcycle to take her shopping, most women we know will pick the motorcycle. So you somehow got to make that available. So there's all kinds of changes that are needed that you can make, but to do it humanely, what you've got to operate on is the birth rate. If you don't operate on the birth rate, then the death rate is going to operate on you. In other words, it's not a choice of growing forever and having as many children as everybody wants. It's a choice of either we're going to reduce the number of births, or nature is going to take care of it by increasing the number of deaths, which it's done many times before and maybe in the process of doing right now. But
even if 8 billion people immediately got access to contraception, women, so that's less than 8 billion people. But even if they all got access to contraception, then we wouldn't be any near to 2 billion in the next, I don't know how many decades.
Yeah, that's correct. So it means that while you operate on that, you also got to operate very hard on consumption, on change. For the classic example, which people still talk about but are not doing, is getting rid of fossil fuels. Getting rid of fossil fuels fast will cause some considerable disruption. There'll be a lot of things you can't do easily, and there are going to be some of them that are very serious because it's getting hotter all the time, and fossil fuels are used to cool places. If you go to China, you can see them building dozens of high-rise apartments, all with low ceilings and no sign of being able to be cross-ventilated, all cooled by air conditioning. And when you open your car window, you smell the smoke coming from the coal-fired plants that produce the air conditioning. So just starting the population towards shrinkage is nowhere near the entire solution to avoiding a collapse. But it's an essential one if in the long term you're able to avoid a collapse. Taking care of 5 or 6 billion people at the end of this century will be a lot simpler, if we can manage it, than taking care of 12 billion people.
Despite your lifelong work and efforts to slow down the population growth, humanity is not on a track to curb the growth in a way that we could live sustainably on the planet, as you mentioned. So what's your view on humanity in the 21st century?
I think we have possibly 1 or 2 more decades before civilization collapses. And you can see the lack of interest in the big problems in many ways. But one of them is when you look at the population situation, everybody who is knowledgeable knows that the first thing you should do in order to reduce the fertility rate is give full rights and opportunities to women, make them at least equal to men in all respects. And there's not a single nation in the world, including Sweden, that doesn't treat women as well as they treat men. And one of the things that we know from many, many different basically social experiments is that if you give women control over their bodies and full rights, they have fewer children, curiously enough.
Why aren't we doing that? I mean, why are men worldwide so afraid to give women equal rights?
I wish I had the answer. Of course, evolutionarily, men turned out to be stronger, and women, it turns out, actually have to put a lot more effort into reproduction than men do. And so the men have had the sort of dominant position physically, and also in time they can give to their political activities, which is a little difficult, particularly in our normal time. That is, when we were hunter-gatherers, women supplied often most of the nutrition, worked harder, longer, and also had to bear and care for the children. And so I think that's sort of the evolutionary roots of our current situation. And of course, in the United States, things are going backward in that regard. And the thing that I find most puzzling is how well the culture overrides women's self-interest. So that, if, for example, in our country, women are in the majority, if they voted right, they could control the situation. We had a long battle for an equal rights amendment in our Constitution, and it lost because too many women wouldn't vote in favor of it. So, difficult question. I wish I had a sure answer. My sure answer is, though, if we don't do something about it, it's going to wreck civilization.
You're right. And I'm wondering, me as a woman and as a mother, this is something that I like. I want to have equal rights. I want to have access to contraception. So I'm just wondering whether most of your critics were men. And how did women feel about your work?
Well, of course, my work has all been joint with a woman, namely Anne. And so, and of course, many of my students have been female. I've worked with women all my life. My closest colleagues today are 4 people, 3 of them Mexican, 2 male, 1 female, and 1 American female, that is, besides Anne. So actually, in my closest colleagues, I'm 3-2 in favor of women. So I think that's all you can do, and keep talking to women about these issues because it's really necessary to keep them on the front burner and to get women's views and attitudes on this. They have so much different, very different lives in the United States and around the world. And that's about what
I read an interesting article from Joe Bish, who works for a Population Media Center, where he wrote that there are forces at work that are keeping contraceptive prevalence low in most of sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Asia. So do you know who denies women contraception? Who doesn't wish that women had access to it?
Well, first of all, there's a mob of idiots in our country that are labeled Republican. Do you want me to spell it for you?
I'm mostly now talking about the sub-Saharan African countries and Asian countries, so not the U.S.
But the U.S. refusal to give aid is a strictly Republican thing. That is, every time there's a Republican administration, they cancel the ability of the U.S. aid system to supply contraception and so on. So that's one thing. Ignorance is another, but just plain cultural features are another. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa, the culture is strongly promoting the large family sizes and women being in less powerful positions, and that is changing gradually around the world. In poor countries, I mean, some places like Bangladesh have done very well in controlling fertility. But culture changes slowly, and when there are major forces against the culture changing, religious forces, politics in the United States, and so on, this is something that would be difficult to change rapidly, even if the whole world were behind the change. But when you have powerful forces lying about situations and so on, the law in Texas that was just passed that denies women access to abortion is talked about entirely in terms of women's rights, desires, and so on. But what they don't say is that that law has only one major effect, and that is to kill women. In other words, when you pass laws against abortion, you do not reduce the number of abortions. You just change the abortions from a safe, simple medical procedure to a back alley butchery. And we've already seen that starting in Texas. So
what do you mean? I don't understand. I mean, I understand in a case that when a woman is pregnant and she's risking her life, then it can lead to death. But what do you mean about the butchery?
Oh, it's the law is a law to promote murder. That is, when women do not have access to safe abortion, they go to what are often called here back alley abortionists. People who are not physicians, do not know how to do sterile procedures, do not know how to, if there's an accident of some sort, how to properly care for the person. And so when you look at the statistics, what you see is there's no reduction in the number of abortions. There's just a great increase in the number of women who are either badly injured or killed by quack abortionists. Of course, the very fact that many women go have the procedure but then have to drive 6 or 7 hours from out of state to get back to their homes in Texas, after a procedure like that, often alone, it's not a healthy thing for a woman to have to drive for 6 or 7 hours. And if she starts to hemorrhage or something, you're on the road. So the main effect that should be always pointed out is that if you pass anti-abortion laws, you're passing laws that will kill women.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And do you know about any countries now in the world that have good family planning programs? Because you mentioned Bangladesh.
Most of the rich countries do reasonably well. If you want to look the places that are outstanding, I would look to Sweden, Denmark, Holland. In other words, the northern European countries do very well, and the southern European countries are doing better all the time. And in many places in the United States, although our medical system is totally broken, people can still get good treatment. In other words, the United States is the only rich country that doesn't have a health plan. The plan here is all designed to make vast profits for the insurance industry, big pharma, and so on. It's not designed to care for people.
But for example, in the past, there were great family planning programs in Iran, Thailand, I think Philippines, Sri Lanka. We mentioned Bangladesh. So are there any countries that are now focusing on family planning and that are doing well?
I I don't know the details. Most of the poorer countries are doing better than they were before, except in sub-Saharan Africa, where there are huge problems.
So, how can we help the region that needs the most help, the sub-Saharan Africa?
Well, the first thing that I think we should do is greatly increase aid and education and so on, so that the people there have much better lives and do not need, can feed their families without having many children to carry water. One of the big things that children do in Africa, they must do, is often travel fairly large distances to bring water back for the family. So if you built the right infrastructure, if you help those countries build infrastructure, that's not a simple thing to do because, of course, in sub-Saharan Africa, just like in Texas, there's a lot of corruption. And so one has to deal with human beings in all these situations, and occasional human beings are not exactly the people we would like to have in charge of the world, at least that I would like to have in charge of the world.
Do you see humanity as a single body, or do you think that there is no such thing as humanity, but just competing civilizations or sums of individuals?
The idea of a global society is a brand new thing from the last century. Basically, that didn't exist before. And it's all part of the problem of bringing our Stone Age genes so rapidly into the industrial age that we haven't been able to adjust our genetic systems to deal with it. One of the things we have to do is recognize that we did not evolve to deal with the kind of problems we face today genetically. We've got to evolve to face them culturally. Makes it very difficult for us to perceive the most important threats to civilization, all of which are really changes in the environmental background. The accumulation of plastics, the accumulation of toxics, the change of the climate. The United States is seeing all kinds of, as is Europe, direct problems of climate change. But even when the news finally mentions that climate disruption is part of it, people don't really register on it. They think of the world as basically constant in which they act, whereas actually what's happening is the entire world is changing at an unprecedented rate, but we haven't evolved to easily detect that. It takes training to understand that the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is more important to you than even the virus that's causing the pandemic at the moment.
So, is there a chance that people can grasp everything that's happening and start to act?
That requires a huge shift in thinking, which is why I and my colleagues tend to be very pessimistic, because even on things that directly affect people, like prejudice against women, prejudice against people with different skin colors, and so on. Those are things that hurt everything, and yet we are having a desperate time trying to cure it. We made a lot of progress, we thought, in the United States in the early part of in the middle of the last century. Then along came Trump and reversed it in a matter of months. In other words, this is something we've got to work really hard on. And I don't see any sign that we're even going to try, which is why I think the best cure for the environmental problem is really fine wines. If you drink them, then you can keep your internal environment in great shape while the external environment goes down the drain. So you don't like wine, I can tell.
I do, but I maybe I didn't understand the metaphor.
The metaphor is you've got to lead your own life and make it a reasonable life while you try and solve these problems. If you take it all as serious as it really is, then you're going to have a miserable life.
And since you deeply care about the human civilization, is there something you'd like to say to the current humanity?
What I'd like to say to humanity is We've got to become basically a single small group mentally. We've got to care much more about everybody and do much more for what's been called the common good.
And so practically speaking, what would you say to people that they should do?
What they should do is get educated and get involved. If you don't spend at least 10% of your time helping out society in some way, and there's many ways to do that. If you're a lady, then join there must be a local group for women's liberation, it was often called, and so on. If you work hard to give women more rights and opportunities politically, get out and demonstrate, whatever. If you are interested in, I give you a good example. Greta Thunberg shows what an individual can do on a mass problem. In some ways, the climate disruption is, except for nuclear weapons, probably the biggest immediate threat that we face. And she's obviously helped there, one person. What if there were a billion Greta Thunbergs? If 1 in 8 people just got involved in climate at the level she is, the climate problem probably would be solved, even though today nothing is being done about it. But she, at least greatly increased knowledge of it, inspired a lot of young people. So what we need is 8 billion Greta Thunbergs on each topic.
But why do you think that there are so few active people? For example, I wanted to organize one voluntary activity, and I was trying to get some people to participate. And it was quite hard to get volunteers because when people have children, they make excuses that they have to take care of the children. And when they don't have children, they have so many other activities and they go for trips and they have hobbies. So it's so hard to engage people older than, 25 years when they are not students and when they have loads of free time to actually do something for others.
Well, that's, again, part of the cultural change we have to make. If you change the laws so the most a owner of a business could make was 10 times what the lowest paid employee got, as opposed to today in the U.S., I think it's 350 times, then people wouldn't feel so desperate that they got to be making money. Well, a lot of that busyness is tied in with the idea that your value is somehow buried in your salary or how much money you have to buy more and more junk. But I mean, if people were raised with the idea that the main thing they had to do was get along not just with their immediate neighbors, but with the people of the world, and jointly keep the world a place where they can have lots to eat, lots to drink, lots of alcohol to drink if they want it, spend time making love, etc., then that if those were their main goals and helping other people, then you could get people to spend the time. But now what do they spend the time doing? What they're told is entertainment.
I would like to thank Population Media Center, Institute for Humane Education, and Biosphere Expeditions for supporting my work by sharing this podcast on their social media. The growing population that was in the public eye in the 1960s and 70s was vanquished from the agenda for so long that the general public, and often even decision makers and environmental nonprofits, have no concern about human numbers, and thus it's barely recognized as an issue at all. Who do you think should lead the discussion about overpopulation now?
Well, I think young people are starting to lead the discussion. As I mentioned earlier, Partha Dasgupta, when the top economist in the world says that we already have more than twice the number of people who will be sustainable, that's a sign things are changing. We have got some people, many people who are environmentally knowledgeable but completely ignorant on population. George Monbiot's a good example. He keeps saying that the problem is not too many people, it's too much consumption. And he misses that terribly impressive and difficult scientific point that one person consuming doesn't consume as much as a billion people consuming. That, in fact, of course, you can't separate the level of individual consumption from the number of individuals. That's so-called a science called arithmetic, which he doesn't grasp. So more and more people are beginning to talk again about population. It's unfortunately very late because, of course, if we had started, say, in 1950, giving full rights to women, giving around the world, giving every woman, every couple, access to modern contraception and backup abortion, we would be in much better shape today because you can change consumption problems overnight, but you cannot change population problems humanely overnight. It takes a long time for population sizes to change if the change is done humanely, which means we should have started a very long time ago. But I do see some signs of hope, again, like an economist who's very knowledgeable about population, saying that perpetual growth is not the thing we want to do.
But what I've observed is that actually there are very few young people engaged in addressing overpopulation and overconsumption issues.
Well, but they are addressing the basic problem by not having so many children.
Yes, but there are very few people who are willing to talk about population because it's a sensitive issue and they are afraid that they will be labeled as racist or xenophobes and so on. And so there are a couple of organizations that are doing good job, like Population Matters, Population Media Center, and others. But that's just too little compared to all the other big conservation nonprofits that are not talking about population at all.
I agree with that. I have served on the board of one of the big ones and tried to get them to pay more attention. They were very big into recycling. And all I asked them to do was put on their recycling literature that if we kept recycling everything we could, but didn't do anything about population growth, that would delay the end of the world, the recycling, by about 15 minutes. That is, if you don't solve the population problem isn't the only problem, but if you don't solve it, if you keep the population growing, then there's going to be a disaster. There's no question about that. I don't know any scientist personally who would not say you cannot have the population grow perpetually. That's just very, very basic arithmetic, if nothing else. But I agree. Let's put it this way. I have written a memoir, which is not out yet, and I wanted the title to be A Modern Malthus, A Life of Failure, because I have certainly failed. Ann and I started actually in the mid-1960s trying to convince people that it was better to give women rights and have fewer babies, and we failed. And it's just barely coming back, and it's sad. But then again, the environmental movement has failed. I mean, everything is going downhill. Biodiversity is disappearing at a much more rapid rate than it was when we wrote The Population Bomb. Climate disruption is now full scale, killing people and so on, still not doing anything about it. There are still many, many, many people who are malnourished. We're not doing anything about that, and some of them are malnourished right here in rich California. We're not doing anything about that. The thing that is most habituated, that people in the keeping the background steady don't appreciate, is the chances of nuclear war are increasing. That the U.S. program of modernizing our triad, that is our land-based missiles, our sea-based missiles, and our airplane-based missiles, is threatening the Russians and the Chinese. And we still have totally idiotic things like giving submarines to Australia. Australia needs submarines as badly as a fish needs a bicycle. I mean, it's just insane. And yet, we're still at it. And most people don't even know that the chances of a large-scale nuclear war, according to one of my friends who was a Secretary of Defense in this country, is about 50-50 over the next 10 years. How many people understand how near we could be, particularly now with the Chinese as full-scale people in it, trying to take back Taiwan maybe, and so on. And yet people are not paying attention.
What's your vision of the future in, say, 2050?
2050? Let's put it this way. I'm pleased that I'm going to not have to face it. But I think by that time, society, if it hasn't collapsed totally, will be well on the way. I think it's already on the way. In other words, when you see the fascists taking over and so on, that once more, that's a bad time. I remember when I was something like 15 years old, thought that winning the Second World War would solve human problems. And yet, obviously, it didn't. And the technology, unfortunately, again, we're a small group ape that has managed to develop technologies that will allow not just to destroy themselves, but to destroy all the apes on the planet. As a matter of fact, we are wiping out our nearest relatives, the other primates, at a rapid rate. But I'm a human chauvinist. I'd like to see humanity manage to survive and all human beings have reasonable lives, but I see no sign of it.
What do you think the nature will look like in 2050?
Nature will be very much reduced, and that means that also humanity will be very much reduced because we can't get on without nature. Unfortunately, we're utterly dependent on plants. And if you wipe out plants, as we're doing in many ways, for instance, we're seeing huge fires, of course, over Eurasia, North America and Eurasia. It'll be dismal. It's already, by comparison, dismal. In other words, if you know something, for example, when I started out as a kid, my interest in nature focused on tropical fish and butterflies. And butterflies and moths were common over the United States. I could remember driving in the West in 1947 and having to stop the truck fairly frequently to clean the butterflies out of the radiator. And there used to be what they called moth snowstorms. No more. They're gone. And of course, they're, among other things, food for birds. And birds, among other things, tend to eat the mosquitoes. Birds and bats eat the mosquitoes that bring us viruses. And viruses are doing very well. The mass of humanity, the size of our population, makes it just a bonanza for any parasite that can get in. And we're seeing more and more of that.
So with such an apocalyptic vision of the future, do you think it's worth talking about overpopulation and slowing down the growth?
I think it's worth trying. You never can tell. People can change very, very rapidly when the time is ripe, when they recognize something. A good example is that up to December 7th, 1941, the U.S. produced almost 4 million passenger cars. And after December 7th, 1941, soon after, it stopped producing them at all and switched to making it. That was when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, switched to making tanks, planes, eventually nuclear weapons, and so on, suffered hundreds of thousands of deaths, had rationing, and so on. When people recognized a threat, they were able to transform their consumption activities almost instantaneously. And the same thing happened in Britain. It happened in Germany. In other words, when people get the idea that they need to change, they can change very rapidly. So I keep having the hope that someday a president will get up and say, we're in deep trouble. If we're going to keep the country together, we have to do A, B, C, and D. And 20 million Greta Thunbergs will get up and say, hurrah, let's do it. And the world will be saved. But, so you and I have no choice. Both, I can tell, both from personality, background, and everything, you can't stop doing it even if you think it may be hopeless. So I'm a creature of habit. I've talked about population so long, I can't stop for the last 3 weeks of my life.
In one of your previous interviews, you said one of the things we've proven beyond doubt in the last decade is that telling people the scientific facts doesn't make them change their behavior. So how should we talk about the unsustainable growth in population and consumption so that common people and policymakers will listen and not immediately label you as a xenophobe or racist?
Well, you actually mentioned one of the solutions, the population media group, that actually they do an interesting thing. They go to a place where there's a very high birth rate. They do surveys of attitudes on women's rights, on the availability of contraception, and so on. And then they develop a hot soap opera that has got a great plot and is really interesting. But they insert into it these issues so that one of the women who's very developed as a very nice person has an unwanted pregnancy, and she deals with the issues. And in another situation, a husband is brutal to a wife, and she figures out how to deal with it, and so on. After the soap opera runs for a while, they do another survey and find out that attitudes have changed rather dramatically. And that is because people like stories, like narratives for the whole time. After all, when we didn't have TV and we didn't have radios and we had small groups and we didn't even have books, what did people do? They sat around and told each other stories. We like stories.
Yeah, I agree. People love stories. I'm just thinking that talking about overpopulation or slowing down the population growth might be a bit sensitive, especially in poor countries, which are suffering from a lot of injustices and colonial past and suffering from the climate change. So how would you talk about this issue in a way that is positive and doesn't hurt people?
One of the things that has proven to be very successful is family planning programs. And it isn't that they're just successful because they give people access to contraception and backup abortion. It turns out they have very big educational impacts, and that the two go along together, and that the general status of women improves if they're family planning programs. So if every government on the planet said we're going to put 5% of our budget into helping women with their reproductive lives and helping men to deal properly with them, I think we would change the situation rapidly. After all, it has already changed. There has been a general trend, particularly in rich countries, of smaller families, and some countries are now stopping growth or are going to start shrinking soon. But the biggest reproductive rates, of course, are in the poor countries, where, among other things, children still in agricultural situations are valued farm labor. And so there are ways that can be tackled, too, if there's redistribution. One of the things that you keep hearing is, if only we get richer and richer, eventually things will dribble down to poor people. That's nonsense. What we need is redistribution. We should take 98% of Bill Gates' money away from him, even though he's trying somewhat to help elsewhere, but virtually all should go to improving the situation in poor countries, and there are different ways of doing it in different countries. Some of the African countries should not maybe become industrial. They should get the industrial things they need from countries already totally ruined, like England, for example, and make their contribution to the world by running, as some of them do, like Namibia and Botswana, excellent tourist programs. All this stuff can be worked out in theory. The problem is, how the hell do you do it in practice?
Exactly. Yes, because that leads me to another question. Sometimes I feel like it's only a few scientists that think that overpopulation is a problem, because politicians and businesses and religions are most definitely not interested in this topic. On the contrary, they promote the population growth. How can you win the battle when the opponents are much stronger, powerful, and richer?
The way that the mob, which is something I founded with Anne, trying, is to get civil society organized to focus on the big problems. There are a lot of people who are involved in what they think of as good works. It may be supporting opera. It may be working for women's rights. It may be making sure that animals are not tortured, that sort of thing. But what the mob tries to do is focus the attention of civil society first and foremost on the existential threats. That is, no matter how much you care about the treatment of pets, if the temperature of the globe goes up another 6 degrees Celsius, there are not going to be any pets. There's been enormous interest in the mob. Have you gone to the website? You can see all the blogs and all the interest and so on. We're going to have to close it down. Nobody will support it.
Really?
You can't get any money to keep it going. I have raised a lot of money at Stanford University to support it, but the administration now is so out of it and so hidebound that I can't spend the money, basically.
I'm so sorry to hear that. The mob, or the Millennium Alliance for Humanity and the Biosphere, is such a nice initiative. I don't really understand why they don't want to support it. Life's unfair, isn't it?
The smartest thing I ever did was to be born in 1932. I knew about the Depression from my parents. My father lost his job just after I was born. And then I was old enough to know the Second World War. I followed with pins on a map and so on what went on. And then I went to college with the veterans who grew me up very, very fast. I mean, I was not allowed to be a fraternity boy or something like that. We talked serious stuff when I was 17 and 18 and in college. And then just as I went into science, they started the National Science Foundation and began to fund science. So in graduate school, I was well supported. And then there were lots of jobs when I came out. And I went through the rich period for science and a period when we did very well on a lot of things. I mean, when I was a graduate student, we desegregated the restaurants in Lawrence, Kansas, and so on. And so I got to know a lot about the world and had a wonderful life. And I was hoping to check out before it went down the drain. But then again, Trump came along and speeded the whole process. So that now, instead of, I thought in retirement I would be able to drink great wines, read good books, eat a lot of chocolate, slowly chase women, and instead I spend my time fighting idiots. So
yeah, well.
So your generation's going to have to do it, and I'm glad you're doing it. Let's put it this way.
What are the most important life lessons that you learned?
The most important life lessons I learned is marry the right woman. That's very important. We've been married for 66 years now, and it's nice to have an intellectual partner. And she was also, and still is, absolutely beautiful. So that's important. And I think maybe the second most important one is that friends are the key thing to a wonderful life. While you try and save the world, enjoy yourself.
That's good. Paul, thank you so much for this wonderful interview and great work that you and your wife, Anne, who could sadly not participate in today's discussion due to health problems, you've been doing. So thanks a lot.
It's my great pleasure. And when I get my book out, I'll be happy to talk to you about it and send you a copy.
Yes,
That'll
please.
be next. That'll be a year from now, though. So I have to live for a year, which I'll give a try anyway.
Thank you very much for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Paul Ehrlich, you can go to Google and type in his name, and you will get plenty of articles and books that he wrote. And I would also suggest you to look at the website of MAHB. That's mahb.stanford.edu. It's a very nice initiative, and hopefully Paul will find someone to support it further. Anyway, again, thanks for listening, and if you'd like to hear more episodes like these, subscribe to Nature Solutionaries podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Stitcher. See you next time.